Hey, Lee here, helping you become a better plant parent. Let's answer some community questions and help people along their journey. The first question is, I have a Monstera that's growing like crazy in a tiny pot. Is it too late into the season to repot? Now, there is a best time to repot your Monstera, but you can basically get away with repotting it at any time. You may have heard that plants go dormant in the winter, and it's important to think of this dormancy when talking about indoor plants as slowed down growth. There are very few plants that actually die back in the winter or stop growing completely when we're talking exclusively about indoor tropical houseplants. So in the fall and winter, you will have slowed down growth. And what this means in terms of repotting your plant is that it can be very dangerous and leave you more susceptible to root rot when compared to repotting in the spring or the summer. Now, because the roots are absorbing water at a much slower rate, that means that the new soil that are around those old roots will absorb water much slower. And because they're absorbing water much slower, this is increasing your chance of actually getting root rot in your plant. If it stays too wet for too long, this is what will actually lead to root death. And this is why repotting in the fall or the winter is much more dangerous than compared to the spring or the summer. So there are ways that you can mitigate this risk. For example, if you are going up in pot size by only 1 inch, or if you're using terracotta pots. Because terracotta pots are porous, they actually wick away some of the unused water inside the pot and release it out into the air. This decreases your plant's chance of overwatering. So if you're someone who is repotting in the fall and the winter months, definitely go with terracotta over plastic. But you can absolutely just wait. Monsteras do like to be pretty snug in their pot, and you can actually mitigate a lot of the damage from a root-bound pot by watering more frequently and fertilizing your plant effectively. So this plant right here is a Monstera subpinnata that I ordered online, and it came in sphagnum moss, so I was just pulling things out to check on the roots to make sure it was doing okay. The roots look pretty healthy. I don't really see much rot. There's just a few pieces that are a little bit moist. Because it was shipped, the moss was a little bit more wet than I prefer. So I'm just pulling those little bits off, and then it will be ready to go back. So the next question is about a Pilea peperomoides. And it says, I've had my plant for over a year and it's still a small size. One leaf dies and another grows in an endless cycle, and I don't know why. So the main thing that you have to do is figure out sun, soil, and water for plants. Do those things first before you start to worry about things like fertilizer, things like nutrient deficiencies. It's actually pretty rare that your plant will have a nutrient deficiency if it's getting good sun, has the appropriate soil, and is getting watered effectively. So some things that you can do is, first of all, research the plant. Make sure you know how wet the soil likes to stay. Try to water it effectively. The Pilea peperomoides doesn't really like to be completely dry, so you should be using a long stick if you can, like a wooden dowel or a bamboo stake, to put it all the way down in the soil to make sure that it's wet enough for you, or dry enough for you to water it again. The soil for the Pilea peperomoides, I find it doesn't really matter that much. They do fairly well in typical potting soil, but I do recommend adding a little bit of perlite if you have a chance. But again, it's not really necessary. These plants are pretty hardy. And in terms of sun exposure, you really have to figure it out. Make sure you're experimenting, moving it to different places in your house. Find out what's working the best, and make sure that as you move your plant to different locations, think about how more sun exposure will lead to you needing to water your plant more frequently. So make sure that you're still thinking about those things as you're trying to figure out what works best for your plant. And another question about the Pilea peperomoides is, I have the same plant and it's only having new growth at the top. The lower half is brown. Now, I love this question because it exposes a lot of the garbage that's going on Instagram in the houseplant community. People angle their plants to make them look as amazing as they possibly can. Now, the thing about this plant, the Pilea, is that it's actually supposed to look like that. This plant This plant can't sustain the amount of leaves that it has. I know this plant looks fantastic, but it's all an illusion. Half of this plant, well, maybe the bottom third of this plant is actually brown. If you look from about right here down to the pot, let me see if I can hold it up. Right here down to the top of the pot is completely bald. The only reason why this plant looks so full is that as the leaves start to get bigger, they droop down and they're actually covering this giant portion of the stem that's actually has nothing there. And as it keeps growing, it can't sustain that many leaves, so the bottom ones just keep falling off. As you can tell, the bottom leaves just keep falling off, and that's okay. So if you're always comparing to the plants that you see on Instagram, you are never going to be happy. It's not a competition, just try to grow the best plants that you can. So this plant right here is a philodendron mayoi, and what I'm gonna try to do is air layer this plant. The plant's roots in this cup are actually doing fantastic, and I do have this other root right here that's growing in really healthily. So I'm going to try to air layer it right there so I can cut this plant up and give it away. So the struggle with this is always making sure that it's wrapped tightly enough around the stem so it's not losing that much moisture that quickly. So we're gonna work at it, probably gonna have to use some tape, and we'll do our best. So while I'm doing that, I'm gonna try to answer another question. When I transplant to soil, my cuttings never do well. What's the trick? And I feel like I know what you might say. Well, what do you think I'm gonna say? Leave it in the comments. What am I gonna say? If your cuttings are not doing well in soil, don't use soil to propagate. Use whatever method that works for you, use whatever you're comfortable with, and use whatever has the highest success rate for you. There's absolutely no reason why you should be stressing over your plant cuttings by using some kind of method that just isn't working out for you. So as I'm filling this up, I'm realizing it's gonna be way too heavy. So let me take some of this out. I'll try to go with half. I don't have any smaller Ziploc bags, so what I'll do is I will roll this up a bit to make it smaller. One thing that I do find really helps with getting your cuttings to root is making sure that you have really great high humidity. With higher humidity, your plants, especially tropical plants like Monsteras and other aroids, they tend to do much better with great humidity. I have failed so many soil propagations that it's not even funny. I've failed Monsteras, pothos, umbrella plants, aluminum plants. I think the only two that have actually worked for me is the Pilea peperomoides and the watermelon peperomia. So basically, I've moved away from using soil because I know it doesn't work in my conditions. I use water and I use sphagnum moss because those work for me, and also they're what I'm most comfortable with. I will have the highest success rate with things that I do a lot, of course, with anything else in life too. This is why I can almost never take advice from someone like Plantarina, great YouTuber, fantastic plants, but she's living in Florida, I'm living in Canada. Things that work for her are probably working for her because of her environment, high humidity, high heat, near constantly in Florida, when I'm working with lower humidity and really big fluctuations in light exposure and temperature. We really need to make sure that we're learning as much as we can and then applying it to our own specific environment. So if you have any plant problems, post them in the comments below and we'll all do our best to answer them. If you're already part of the community, hey, thanks, great job. Like the video if it was helpful and consider subscribing. See you next time.